Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, Suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Jacquelyn Mitchard. Jacquelyn is the award-winning New York Times bestselling author of 12 novels for adults, 7 novels for teenagers, and 5 children's books. These include The Deep End of the Ocean, the inaugural selection of the Oprah Winfrey Book Club. She is also a professor of creative writing whose short stories, articles, essays, and book reviews have been widely published. A native of Chicago, she now lives on Cape Cod with her family. Welcome, Jacquelyn.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to talk.
Where are you in the United States?
I'm in Montana.
Montana. Oh, that's so exotic. How cool.
Well, it's about to snow on us, so it'll feel less exotic. But yes, I've been here about 20 years. I moved from the San Francisco Bay Area. We moved out here to raise our kids right after 9/11, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful place to have a family. So I feel super lucky. Now, we are here to talk about a very inconvenient scandal, the latest by you, and such a fabulous read. Would you please tell our listeners about this book?
Well, what I like to say about this book is that it's everything that can go wrong if you have a family, but if you keep secrets and tell lies, and it goes on for generations between parents and children, and everybody feels sort of ripped off, and everybody feels as though they kind of don't know what kind of ground they're standing on. In other words, they wonder whether they can trust the people who they should be able to trust the most.
Right.
And it begins when Frankie Attleboro, who is a young woman and an up-and-coming underwater photographer, comes home to Cape Cod to tell her widowed dad that she is expecting a baby and she's getting married, the undreamed of. She never thought she would settle down, but her dad has a big surprise for her too. He's marrying her best friend, and they're also expecting a baby, and they kept this as a surprise for her. And so that fractures the family, but that's only the first 20 pages. Everything. There's plenty of mayhem to come.
There is plenty of mayhem to come. So, in many ways, the story is about mothers and daughters, which is something you explore. And of course, you're a mother yourself. We were talking about this before we started to record, that you have 9 children, 5 sons and 4 daughters. So, can you tell us a little bit about sort of what draws you to this type of story of exploring these relationships between parents and children?
If you scratch the surface of any human being, you're going to find childhood trauma or even childhood drama that has influenced the way that person grew up and the choices that they made for the rest of their lives. I had an old friend who used to say, crooked, straight, straight, crooked, that you would always make a decision to not make the mistakes that your parents made in raising you, but you end up making mistakes of your own that then in the next generation, your kids say, one thing I'm never going to do is say what mom said about X, Y, or Z. So you can't win, but you can sometimes emerge standing. My younger brother likes to say that we were out in the ocean with our parents, who were really not particularly good at this. They were that we were out in the ocean, and our kids we were out in the ocean. Our kids are on the beach, but their kids are going to be up on the highway. So
that's for better or worse, right? I don't know if we want our children on the highway, but I understood. Yes.
Up on the not on the highway yet.
On mountaintop. I get it. That's right. Well, I do think And of course, as a mother myself, that's absolutely true. There were things I absolutely said to myself, I'm not going to do this to my child. And she's, I had two children. My daughter's 23, and I am learning that, yeah, I didn't do those same things, but I did other things that were now like, oh, maybe that wasn't the best idea either. That is interesting. And the dynamic between, these two best friends, God, it is so interesting because that is another thing. Like one of them left and explored, and the other one stayed, back in town and lived as what we'd maybe consider a smaller life. Um, and yet, their relationship, that profound, connection of them between as children, really is still there, despite the fact that Frankie has all this difficult emotion around what she feels, the feeling of betrayal, right? Because her mother is
Right. She
gone.
feels that Ariel and her father have betrayed her. And I guess in that situation, in fiction, we used to talk about forgiveness. And now we talk about empathy. And I guess Frankie lacks empathy for the choices that her father and Ariel have made. But those choices are pretty difficult to stomach. And I know
Yes.
that firsthand because this happened to me, not
Oh,
with my best friend,
wow.
but this story was loosely inspired by my father. I'm writing an essay about this now called When Dad Married the Kid Next Door, because my father fell in love with a woman I went to high school with, and I walked, this was a surprise to me. I literally walked in the door on the west side of Chicago, and my dad said, "Meet my new girlfriend." And I said, "You're Barbara, and I went to high school with you." "Yes," she said. And it was something that was very difficult to take. I
Yeah.
mean, we didn't live in Hollywood. We lived on, we were a blue collar family from the west side of Chicago. And this wasn't like David Foster marrying Catherine McPhee or something like that. This was someone who was known to me, and a shocking situation to walk in and see my mother's 25th anniversary diamond on somebody else's hand. It was just appalling. And I never got over it. I
Right.
never really came to terms with it. Maybe I would have if I had been a better person, or if perhaps they had been more graceful about the way that I don't know. I just don't.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
know.
and your mother was gone. I assumed your mother
My
had.
mother had died many years before. Like Beatrice in A Very
Yeah.
Inconvenient Scandal, she had died when she was only in her early 50s. And
Hmm.
I had been terribly close to her the way Frankie was with her mother.
Yeah.
Ariel was estranged from her mother. One of the best friends had a lyric relationship with her mother, and so did Ariel, who considered Beatrice another mother to her because
Right.
her mother had sort of taken off when she was a teenager.
Right.
And you would think of Mac, who marries Ariel, as a sort of pervert if you didn't realize that he was never around. He didn't
Right.
pay any attention to his own children, much less their friends.
Right.
And so it was only as an adult that he got to know Ariel when she was working for the Saltwater Foundation, that it was his foundation.
And there is this, I mean, it's interesting that you talk about your own experience. I mean, my parents also split, and my dad ended up marrying a woman that he had an emotional, relationship with ahead of time or whatever. And it is true. It feels,
What a
it,
cad. I mean,
I,
a good father in other ways, but for Pete's sake.
I know, but isn't this men? I mean, Jacqueline, I found out, this is like, and this is all over social media for me. I've been very candid about it, but I found out at Christmas that my husband of 31 years had a 2.5-year affair with his massage therapist. So I'm in the middle
And
of a
it would be a
divorce.
massage therapist too, wouldn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
everyone who knows where all your buttons are.
Yes, of course.
That
There's
is
such
absolute.
intimacy. Yeah.
And you're still together?
No, no. I
Oh,
tried.
Good girl. I was going to say, you forgave that asshole. No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't swear on podcasts, but
no, you can swear all you want. It's true. And it's, I really tried. I really thought, well, we have these beautiful children. We have this beautiful life. We moved to Montana together and I wanted to, but he really couldn't get, I think he's just, is this midlife, it's this weird crisis where I think they're trying to regain their youth, or I don't really know. But no, yeah, no, we're divorced, or we're mostly divorced. But it is interesting. Like I look at him and think, because of course there's so much betrayal and so much hurt, and I look at it and think, you were with me when my dad did this to my mom. How could you? How could you do the same thing?
And there
Yeah,
is a difference between men and women in that men are sort of eight-celled creatures in many ways. They
yeah,
see what they want and they take it. And it's
yeah,
very difficult for what I tried to portray in the book, that Mac was a very compassionate man. I mean, he went around the world trying to
right.
save species from extinction, and charming audiences of people by interesting children and other people in the natural world. But when it came to his own natural world, he had no idea why this would really upset his daughter. He expected
Right.
her to take the wedding photos, and provide the cake. He was just clueless
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think that's exaggerated. Certainly, we always exaggerate in fiction, but it's not really that exaggerated.
I think it's a real, and what's crazy. So I'm 50, almost 53, and it is, and all of us, and all of our sort of close friends are becoming empty nesters, and it's everywhere. Jacquelyn, it's everywhere. It's like I have like a half dozen friends that right now are like basically going through the same thing, and I think it's like an epidemic. And I do feel like, and then I also, like, you have sons, I have a son. I'm like, okay, how do we, how do we teach these men to be different than their dads? I mean, I
We're
like to think,
raising men differently. We're raising better men. I
I
am
think that's true.
absolutely convinced of that. I have two sons who are married, and they are exemplary husbands who are right there,
Yeah.
right there emotionally for their wives. I really think that this was, perhaps in my case, I'm older than you by 10 plus years. And I think in my generation, there was a great deal more leeway paid to men. Boys will be boys,
Yeah.
if you don't
Right.
do it, some other women will. And my mother-in-law is still telling me this when I refuse to clean up after my husband. And I always say to her, listen, if some other woman wants to come and clean up after him and do a load of laundry, that is fine with me. She can just come right in here and take over some of this stuff, and we'll be best friends. We'll be like sister wives. Anyway,
Yeah.
there was just a different way of looking at couplehood when I
Yeah.
was young, and definitely women were in the down position. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure they aren't still in some key ways, but not nearly so much as was the case when I was growing up. And that
Yeah.
was accepted. I was a rebel because I didn't want to walk in the footsteps of any fella. And, I was widowed when I was in my late 30s, and the
Oh, I'm
man I
sorry.
married, thank you. And the fellow whom I'm married to now is younger than I am, okay, by 10 plus years. And you can just see how different he is
Yeah.
from my first husband, who was older than I by 6 years, and how much more he was raised by a single mother. He's much more aware of the responsibilities of women and how valid those are and how
Yeah.
difficult those are. And so it's a much easier road to hoe in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, and look at, I mean, you are a powerhouse of a woman. So I think that's one of the other things I've realized is that sort of men, some men, and this is not, we're not bashing men because there's lots of wonderful men, but some men feel a little bit lessened by the sort of success of their wives, and it becomes this, like, my success becomes sort of like his failure. And I think that's, and was always a huge, like, he was always a, really strong proponent of my writing and all that stuff, but I do feel like I didn't need him in the same way that I needed him when I was young, and I think that became hard. I think it's hard. They have a different sort of, they need to feel needed, and I think that didn't he wasn't getting that. So,
Well, for years, my husband raised the kids and stayed home because I was on the road. This was when authors were
yes.
traveling all over, at some generations ago. Now we're lucky if they send you to the CVS, to sign books on the rack.
I
But
know.
it was a different set of circumstances then. And I was pleased with that, but I was also pleased when he took up the reins of doing something of his own that he
Right.
cared about, because it made a huge difference in our relationship. I
Right.
think everybody has to have something that, even if it frustrates you or doesn't entirely fulfill all your professional needs, is something that you're invested in and that you care about, that's outside your relationship.
Right. And outside your children, because they grow up and go away. And then, you're left in a situation where the thing that you spent most of your time on, right? And certainly most of your resources, financial and
Sure.
emotional, disappears from your life in a way that you want, right? You celebrate that they grow up and launch, but then it leaves this big sort of, and I think we underestimated how that would be for, him. And I think that was really interesting too. I do, coming back to the book, I want to talk
Yes.
about Ariel, because I think her situation is also, super profound. And actually, it's Ariel sort of, um, her so deep desire to love and be able to marry Mac, and also maintain the relationship she has with Frankie, Mac's daughter, that is, I think, such a beautiful example of sort of the contradictions in all of us, right? She knows why Frankie feels this way, and yet she also knows this is what she wants. And, talk
She
about
even
that.
feels that it's just for Frankie to feel the way that she does.
Yes.
She has enormous empathy for the
Yes.
way that Frankie feels, but this book in some ways is about the search for love,
Yeah.
and how we all want to be part of something. In fact, Ariel talks about, no, it's the girlfriend, the sort of mean girl from high school who's reformed, Alabella,
Yes. I love
who
Alabella.
talks to Frankie and says, "You and Ariel had a we of me. You had a contained and supportive relationship, and we all envied it.
Right.
And that was part of why we tortured you. But each of us wants a we of me. Each of us
Yeah.
wants to be someone who is part of something that is lasting and profound and deep, and it cannot be denied."
Mm-mm. And I think the thing that's interesting is, like, Ariel spent so much time at Frankie's house because her own home was so lacking in the things that Beatrice provided. And it really was Beatrice, because Mac, as you said, was traveling so much. And I think it makes sense to me, like, emotionally, if you grew up the way Ariel did, that, you know, stepping into Beatrice's shoes in that way, becoming
Yeah.
Mac's wife, is sort of the ultimate, um you know success, or, rebirth for a very hard youth, right?
Yes, and also why when her mother, and this is no spoiler really, when her mother returns, because her mother, I mean, that happens early on in the story, although no one
Yes.
knows what's going to happen with Carlotta coming back. Ariel is very open to that.
Yeah.
She is poignantly grateful that her mother, better late than never, wants
Right.
to be involved with her life, so much so that she is not at all skeptical, although Frankie makes up for all that skepticism.
Yes, she definitely does. But it makes sense. It's sort of the way that we always, I mean, we rewrite the history of these broken relationships and these unhealthy relationships our whole, ever after. We think like, what if, if she showed up now, if he came back now and said, reformed and said he was so sorry. And, you know, there's this part of you that just hopes beyond hope for that, right?
You
And of
bet.
course you're open to it. You're like, well, if it's different this time. So it's, I mean, the longing of a little girl for her mother is never going to go away, right? It
No, and
doesn't.
certainly I was in that situation too. My mother died when I was barely 20 and
Yeah.
19, and she left a huge hole in our lives
Yeah.
because she was the one who did all the emotional work. She
Yeah.
wasn't perfect by any means, but my dad was gone
Right.
not gone physically, but he was not there for
Yeah. He
being
wasn't
a father
equipped.
at all.
Right, right. Of course, and that's how they were raised. I mean, that's how
Exactly.
that's the generation of men. They didn't certainly they didn't get involved in emotion. That was a woman's territory. And women were, hysterical. There's all these things that we learn about the way that our parents grew up that makes it easier to understand their shortcomings, even if it doesn't make them go, even if it doesn't still hurt. So Ariel's response to her mom, and actually everybody's response to her mom is, Mac is excited. Frankie's brother is like, oh, everyone's sort of open to it except for Frankie, right?
Except for Frankie.
Except for Frankie. And
She sees
Frankie's,
what's underwater because she's an
yes,
underwater.
yes,
She sees what's below the surface and she is skeptical about it. And I think in part that is a measure of her love for Ariel, is that
yeah,
she just doesn't want her to be hurt and
again,
wants to protect her if she can, even though it isn't her place. So it's a complicated story
yeah,
about people's reactions to the way that other people's families run. And there are so many moving parts in terms
yeah,
of who was really responsible for what when, that you don't find out until the story is well underway. That I wanted to make people wonder what's really going on under the surface of
yeah,
your own family.
yeah,
Do you know, and what are you only going to know when you open a box someday in the future and find some letters in there
I
or something?
know. Oh,
Because
yes,
everybody wonders what's the truth. And
right.
even if we think our parents have been extraordinarily frank with us, and I think I've been extraordinarily frank with my children, sometimes to their dismay,
Yeah.
that there are always things that people wonder about and really won't know until they become that parent and grandparent generation.
It's so true. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of how you write, but first I want to talk about the underwater photography because it's such an incredible, first of all, it works on so many levels, right? Like you said, she sees things under the surface and it is, and it is a place where, she gets to disconnect from everything and, she's under her own sort of power. It's magical. I love everything about the way you use that career. And I almost was like, I want there to be photographs in this book so I can see what she's doing. But I love it. So tell me how that came to you. Like, were you thinking of it as a metaphor or do you have
I've never
experience?
thought of a metaphor in my life, Danielle. When
They-
people read my books and they say, oh, the biblical symbolism of the guy who can't, I say, right. But I have no idea, that
yeah.
is underwater for me. They call it the
Mm.
subconscious for a
Yes.
reason. But the truth is, I could not figure out a profession for this protagonist.
Hmm.
Every in what do you want to say, in literary fiction or women's fiction, everyone is, so there are some pretty standard professions. Some people are professors, many other people are pastry chefs for
Yeah.
some reason. There's just there's even a pastry chef in my story,
Yes.
but I had to think of something that she could be that was intriguing but not intrusive. I couldn't have her be a dentist and
Right.
go to the office every day. I couldn't have her be a neurosurgeon because I would have had to know too much about neurosurgery, and that would have become the point of the story. So I had to find something that was alluring and visual.
Right.
The part, I'm thinking of the part of her looking out through the water and seeing whales underwater and wanting to call her mother on the phone and tell her about it. That that would not intrude on the basic business of the story.
Yeah.
And the worst thing you can do, you know this, you're an author, the worst thing you can do is have someone be a writer in a book.
Right.
And so my agent said, have her be an underwater photographer. And I said, okay. And I went right to work on that because there are such, Brian Scarry and David Dublier, those models that she followed were just do extraordinary work. And I got very, very interested in the subject sort of by default. And now I don't know what I'm going to, speaking of, I don't know why your podcast is called Killer Women, but in my next book, the one I'm working on now, one of the women is a magazine writer.
Interesting.
And the other one is a call girl.
Yeah. Those are
do, right?
Yes, you do. Well, and the other thing I love, we talk about killer women because we're all like, we're killing it, sort of like the, powerful women, but also obviously women who kill people in their stories, if not in real life, hopefully. But one of the other things I love about her, about the fact that Frankie is an underwater photographer, is that pregnancy so changes, her ability, like it really, her job is a little risky, obviously, because there's a lot of unknowns under that water. And all of a sudden she's going to be a mother. And also your buoyancy changes, your body changes. So there's a lot of really interesting, like it's intrusive in her job in a way that it isn't as intrusive if you're a writer or it's intrusive if you're a call girl for sure, but it's not as intrusive if you're, if you're other things. So I think in that way, it's also really powerful because she's so in love with this, her new husband and the baby and all of that, that it becomes a sacrifice she's willing to make, which she probably wouldn't have been necessarily willing to make, years before. And I love that element.
Absolutely, she would not have. And she's reluctant. She has to really give herself a talking to, because what if you run out of oxygen and you're underwater and you die and you're single, that's a tragedy.
Yeah.
But if you are a mom and a wife and you have a young family, it's an absolute catastrophe that destroys other lives as well.
Yeah.
So she just wasn't able to justify the risks that she took before. Now, I know many women who are, for example, firefighters.
Yeah.
And they have children.
Yeah.
But one of them explained to me, how often do you really do this? Mostly I cook chili at the firehouse, and I go out and someone has set their couch on fire and we put that out and then we go home.
Right.
It's very rare that I'm going into a fully engaged house to rescue people. That probably happens 4 times in a career.
Right. But there's police. You think about the police officers who, but I also think it's particularly valid for Frankie, whose mom died, right? Like, so she knows what it's like to have that gap in her life. And so she's also going to be, I think, because of that, much more risk adverse around her own son, right? And the loss that he would feel had, if he were to lose his mother. So it's a beautiful way that you've added another layer. I mean, and I think, to your point, and I understand this from my own working, it's all of a sudden these things, they layer themselves, and you didn't quite plan it, but then it
No.
turns out so beautifully. And I think that's
She even talks about wanting to raise her son to take risks,
yeah.
that she doesn't want him to be the kind of person who hangs back.
Mhm.
And yet, thinking about, as a mother, you think all the time about how much I don't know how much risk they can bear. How much can I bear
Exactly.
in terms of seeing them do things that I just sometimes wish I didn't know about.
Exactly. You want to wrap them in bubble and be like, okay, just sit in the corner,
Right.
you'll be fine. Exactly.
Right.
So tell us, what's the process of this book? Like, and you obviously hugely successful, written a ton of wonderful novels. How do you do it? Is there a method? Do you sort of figure it out? It feels so organic. So I'm curious to know if you plot it.
I figure it out almost to the word before I
Interesting.
ever start to write. I need to know what the first sentence is, and in a general way, what the last sentence is. And the
Okay.
whole progress of the rest of the writing of the book is to get from that first sentence to the last sentence.
But you know what your goalposts are. You know what the scenes are going to happen, how it
And I
ends.
do not understand how all my friends say, I start with a character and I look at the character and I'm fascinated by that person or that image, and I have no idea what's going to happen in the story. That comes to me as I write. That would make me nuts. I could never do anything like that. I'm a very planful person. Like, I
Uh-huh.
have to go to somewhere for this book in November, and I said to my husband last night, can you find my yellow suitcase? And he said, wait a minute. And I said, well, I want to pack my suitcase. I just want to know that I'm not going to forget.
I'm that way about that kind of thing as well. That is exactly. He's like, "Are you leaving tomorrow?" And you're like, "No, but I want to be prepared for when it's time."
And he's packing, if he has to go someplace for work or if he has to go someplace with friends, he starts thinking about that but he starts thinking about Christmas the day before too. And I keep saying, Chris, for God's sake, it happens the same time every year. Don't you realize that that's not going to change, and that
Yes,
most people think about it? They don't go to the mall and buy everyone some stuff from the kiosk on Christmas Eve.
that is
Oh,
so.
you know,
Well, speaking of, finding, planning and finding time. You have 9 children, which I think is so extraordinary and fabulous. And you've been doing, like we talked about this, they're about 20 years apart, start to finish.
right,
And of course, so you really, you are always writing within the sort of pillars of being a mother. So how do
right,
you, they're older now, obviously, but you did this for a long time when they were little. So
right.
how did you set up your life? And I still wonder how you set up your life. Like, doesn't one of them call
I
you every day for something?
Yeah, oh, sure. Of course. It's like whack-a-mole when you have that many children. The minute you think, okay, this is great, then the school calls and says, Atticus was tardy for the 7th time, or
Oh,
something.
yeah.
And or something worse than that. I'm lucky if it's something that minor. It
Yeah.
is, uh, I've always said that I have really low standards for the children. But that isn't true. I mean, I'm a
No, of
very
course not.
careful mother. I'm a very noticing mother. I'm shocked when I learn things that were successfully kept from me by like all 9 siblings, because they have a relationship below the surface,
Of course.
and that I knew nothing about, because I think that I'm pretty much on the ball, and they are obviously my highest priority.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if I'm able to write, which I care deeply about, and that's like my 5th highest priority,
Yeah.
then it must be something that is really important to me. And they have made a significant number of sacrifices of my time for that pursuit for me to write, which also helps to support them.
Yeah.
But they don't really care about that.
Yeah.
Especially when my older children were young, they really minded that that I would go away to work on a story or something like that. And it would be intrusive and it would rob our relationship of time together. And is there a way that I justify that? There is not. It happened.
Yeah.
And that was the only way, especially when I was a widow, that I could manage to do this.
Yeah.
And yet I knew that I had very few choices in terms of what I could do. That I had been a newspaper reporter, I had been a speechwriter. And when I got the idea for my first novel, which was The Deep End of the Ocean, I never imagined that I could write something at that length, but I did. And, it was successful. And so I went on with that. And it has always been, it's not the kind of job that you can leave behind at the end of the day.
It's a 10th child for you. I mean, that's the thing about these books, right? Is oftentimes, my children, I'll come up from a day of writing, my children will talk to me and I'm still having a conversation with one of the characters. So it is and I think, still for women, although I think we talked about the fact that things are changing, but there's a lot of guilt associated with, you know, leaving your children, right, to pursue something, especially something that feels like, for some reason, it seems like it would be easier to justify if you were going to an accounting job than it is to go to, a writing job.
Yeah, because that's artsy and somehow lightweight, even though it isn't. I mean, Stephen King, God love him. I mean, he's a wonderful fella, but he describes when his children were young, that he had a room and he would, a studio, and he would go into it and no one but the dog could come in for 3 weeks and his food was outside the door. Give me a break.
Yeah.
I mean,
that was Tabitha doing that, right? I mean,
right. Yeah. If it were me, when I came out of that room, social services would be here. It would.
Your children would all be gone. They would have taken them away. It's so true.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's just a different world. Yeah.
It's a different world. And many male authors, again, some of my best friends, they have no idea why it was so hard for me to prioritize, because they just did it.
Yeah.
And the devil took the hindmost.
Yeah. And it's funny that even though we are, society is giving us, or we're earning, or we're scratching out, or however we want to put it, more, more autonomy, more independence, more ability to say, this is mine. I still think if it's biological or societal or patriarchy that is telling us, it's still not quite okay. It's not quite okay for you to pursue this thing versus your husband. Even if you guys consider yourselves equals and you're both doing
equal,
it's still, for some reason, is less acceptable for us. And that is, I think,
even to women. I mean, my sister-in-law will sometimes say to me, my brother had a major career and my sister-in-law has a minor job after 20 years of staying home with the children.
Yeah.
And she would say things to me like, you have to do everything possible for Chris's career. And I would just say, what? Because it was so foreign to me to sublimate but even listen to the language of what you just said. We wrested that from fate. We grabbed it. It wasn't expected or even necessarily desired for us to do that.
Right. No, I think there's a lot of people, men and women, who would be much more comfortable if we were just happy to do, the sort of traditional role of raising children, and I think it's true that there's a deficit in community because we're not doing that, but it shouldn't be our responsibility. It should be a shared responsibility, right?
there's a deficit in community anyway, because so many people, more women now than men work outside the home.
Yeah.
A greater number, well more than half of women work outside the home as well as men. So there isn't that sort of neighborhood feeling. I mean, the closest thing I have to that is my book club.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a community organization for me, because I'm not a churchgoer and things like
Right.
that those other traditional sources of community are not as much present in the world that we live in now. Now, I don't miss them. I'm not someone who wanted to join things and be part of something. And I'm really happy with my very few friends and my own company and resources, because I feel like my head is filled with people. They're not real.
Right. No,
But yeah, that's
I
something you don't want to say to a psychiatrist.
no,
But,
not unless you tell them what you do for a living first.
right,
But
right.
I think the other thing is, because of sort of the situation, women, we create these incredibly strong friendships. We don't need very many of them, but you need that person you could call in the middle of the night and be like, I got to take one kid to the hospital. Can you come sleep here so that
Right.
you can be with the other, or whatever it is, And I think that is the way we create community. And it becomes sort of like you said, like your book club, a female driven female. I mean, my book club, at least, it's all women, and it's
Mine
not
too.
just the book. We talk about everything. We share, celebrations and tragedies and trauma and all of that, and it becomes this very small community, but so tight knit,
And we're lucky if we spend 10 minutes talking about the book by the end of the evening. There's
right.
people have drank 2 bottles of wine and talked about this one's marriage and this one's divorce and their kids this and the other thing. And but it is almost like a sewing circle from generations ago. You don't end up with a quilt, but you end up with a tapestry of relationships and personalities, all of them accommodating each other.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, it's a beautiful thing, and I thank God for that, because that's the thing that saves us so many days, right?
Yes.
Well, and I'm not going to talk about the end of the book, but I love it. I really, it's just there's just so many layers, and I think we could talk for like 9 hours about this book. But I did want to ask you what you're working on now. I hate to celebrate a new book, but everyone wants to know sort of what's going to be next.
When I was a young reporter, and whenever I say that, one of my kids says, when I was a young warthog. But it's true. The first criminal case that I ever covered was about a young woman who was accused of, she was a call girl, but she was a call girl with a twist. She had been a brilliant straight A scholarship biology student at the university who gave that up to become a hooker. Okay. And no one knew why. And she was accused of murdering 2 of her, and convicted of one of them, of 2 of her most devoted clients for the life insurance money. And I covered that trial. I was fascinated by her. She was beautiful, and clearly very scholarly, not at all. And I don't know how to do this. I mean, not at all the kind of person, not Stormy Daniels. Okay.
Right.
Though she probably has depths I have no idea about.
Exactly. Yeah, I know what you mean. She's not the cliche we expect, right?
I wanted to, in stories, and I don't know if you do this too, we try to understand history, but also to reconfigure it and correct it and provide explanations for things that have no explanation. So I decided to write. She had, this real life person had a great interest in ornithology. The book is called The Bird Watcher, and it's about her neighbor who grew up with her and who now describes her. She's the accessories reporter for a magazine like Vogue, writes about purses and purses and other kinds of
Yeah.
corollary. But yes,
Jewelry,
yes.
belts, accessories. That's so fun.
Yeah, purses and belts. There's a jewelry writer who is specific at that magazine because jewelry is a big deal. But she gets permission to cover this story and to write about her former friend and her former neighbor and what took her to this place. And it's sort of the story of what she finds out about other people's choices and how she tries to change things. Well, that's all I'll tell you.
Yeah, fair. Well, I have to say, and I absolutely love the idea that, first of all, the fact that the real life woman was also an avid bird watcher, like that, or into ornithology. I feel like we are such a bundle of contradictions. And I think maybe that's the beautiful place to end, because I think you do an extraordinary job of capturing those contradictions, which, when we really parse them out, aren't so contradictory, right? Because we can feel such ambivalence over so many things that we basically cast ourselves in two very different lights, and other people cast us that way, and so we are contradictions. And I can't wait for the bird watcher.
We are many things, and it confuses people sometimes when we won't stay in one lane.
Right.
We keep changing lanes, but that to me is the reason for fiction. It's to hover above and watch people change lanes.
And you do it beautifully. Jacquelyn, this is such a wonderful book, everyone. You have to go and get A Very Inconvenient Scandal, and I'll look forward to hearing what you think of it, because it is just beautifully nuanced and complex, and obviously fabulously written. So, Jacquelyn, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, such an incredible chat. Everyone, this is Killer Women with Jacquelyn Mitchard. Don't miss A Very Inconvenient Scandal, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.